Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome to the virtual California African American Museum. My name is Alexandra Mitchell. I'm the manager of education and public programs. As always, we're delighted that you're spending a part of your evening with us. You are in for a very special treat. As usual, if you are joining us for the first time since the 27th, we've reopened. So we look forward to seeing you back in person if you're in the Los Angeles area and are ready to visit museums. We're excited to have you back. We have 5 incredible exhibitions that are up right now. We can't wait to have guests back with us. Tonight, we are discussing hip hop. Hip hop, of course, is one of the most dominant cultural influences in America. Providing historical depth to the next generation's worldview, the recently published young adult adaptation of Jeff Chang's 2005 book, Can't Stop, Won't Stop, explores hip hop's beginnings to the present day. In this new edition, Chang and co-author David E. Cook chronicled the epic events, ideas, and music that marked the hip-hop generation's rise. Based on interviews with DJs, b-boys, rappers, activists, and gang members, Can't Stop, Won't Stop includes unforgettable portraits of many of hip-hop's forebearers, founders, mavericks, and present-day icons. Jeff Chang has written extensively on culture, politics, the arts, and music. Born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, he's the graduate of the Iolani School of UC Berkeley and also of UCLA. David D. Cook was born and raised in the Bronx and is now a longtime resident of Oakland. He's a graduate of Cal Berkeley and a nationally recognized journalist, adjunct professor at San Francisco State, hip hop historian, political commentator, syndicated talk show host, radio programmer, and media justice and community activist. Tonight, they discuss the YA adaptation, of the book with Christine Tina Wright, educator and sociologist, specializing in African American studies, social stratification, urban education, media, and popular culture. Tina received her doctorate in sociology from UC Irvine in 2005 and is currently a tenured faculty member at Los Angeles Southwest College. She has taught for 20 plus years at all levels of California public school systems, from K to 12, community college, and the California State University and University of California. She recently published her book, 360 Degrees, a blueprint for to Black self-determination. 360 Degrees provides a hip-hop centered analysis of society's, racialized history and a blueprint to actualize Black liberation. We invite you to use the question and answer feature tonight to engage all of the panelists. And with that, I turn the conversation over to Tina, Dave, and Jeff.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and welcome, Davey and Jeff. I'm so glad to be here with you. Davey, I want to thank you again for inviting me. Thank you, California African American Museum, for putting this on. And I'm just super excited to have this conversation with the both of you. I've been teaching hip hop course for years, and I've been using Jeff Chang's Can't Stop, Won't Stop for most all of that time. So I'm really, really pleased to be able to talk to you about this new edition, which I've read and loved. And so let's get to it, right?
All right. Good to see you, Tina. Thanks for being here.
Good to see y'all too, for sure. So for me, I want to kind of talk about what the book epitomizes for me is really the art of storytelling, right? You guys do a phenomenal job on, storytelling and bringing it to life, if you will. So one of the first questions that popped in my mind after I finished reading it was I wanted to know your hip hop stories. I know we all grew up with hip hop. We're basically first generation, without really telling our ages. And some of it reads very autobiographical to me, right? So like, there's so many parts of it where I was like, yeah, this is my life. And I'm sure for you, Davey, growing up in the Bronx, even more so. So I wanted to start with that classic brown sugar film question to you both. When did you fall in love with hip hop? So Jeff, you want to start?
Sure. I came to it as a kid growing up on this little island in the middle of the Pacific, as hip hop was going all around the world, with all the hip hop exploitation movies, Breaking coming out of LA, Rapper's Delight, all of that stuff, that particular period. And we got everything kind of as a lot of stuff on the islands, we got everything as an import.
Right.
But immediately for us, the attraction was visceral because, even Hawaii, there wasn't a lot of popular culture centering on, even though it's a society that's predominantly, non-white, predominantly folks
Right.
of color, right? There weren't a lot of heroes that we had who were not of color, who weren't Bruce Lee, right? So it
Right.
was it was the type of thing of seeing like kids on the other side of the country, in New York City, in the Bronx, and their walk, their talk, their music, their dance, their art that gave us a lot of life at a period that was really interesting in island history. It was a period where we actually felt like the islands were slipping away.
Mm.
There was a lot of I've told this story before, but there was a lot of buildings that were going up, and I was just mad at concrete. So
Right.
picking up a spray can, for me was sort of our generational act of rebellion. I think that that's what you know this culture that Black kids in the Bronx created, gave voice to young people all around the world. I was part of that sort of generation, I think.
Sure. What about you, David?
Well, there's when I first got introduced to it, and then is when you fall in love with it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
when I was first introduced to it, it was a buddy of mine named Arnold who had a tape, and well, didn't have a tape, but he was talking about parties that were going on over at Bronxdale, where his cousin lived, with a
Right.
guy named Disco King Mario. So that was the first name I ever heard. And there's no context to it. You don't know what a herc is. There's no Grandmaster Flash. It's like
Right.
there's just a block party
Party. Right.
and a Disco King Mario in Bronxdale. The first time I was introduced to it and saw it was in June of '76 on the Circle Line boat, which is like a commuter boat that is goes along the Hudson River.
Okay.
And I saw a bunch of people getting on the floor and not doing windmills, but doing what we now know as corkscrews.
Okay.
Leg behind the knee. You get on the ground,
Right.
twirl around, and come up. And it was a DJ on there, and he kept playing the same part of the record over and over again. That record was "Jam on the Groove" by Ralph McDonald.
Okay.
So that was my introduction. And then as you start to put these pieces together, I start to want to be really interested in it and started to MC and make pause button tapes and really get a liking for it. But I think the love in retrospect comes when my mom moved out to California and I'm still in New
Mm.
York and I'm on my own
Oh.
for my senior year. I mean, I'm staying with my grandparents, which pretty much been my own. The family
Right.
is broken apart, but the love that I have was going to the T Connection, going down to a Harlem World, going to those
Got
parties,
you.
and that became, in retrospect, the family like that. The family broke up, but I would not change that senior year, my last
Right.
year in high school, for anything, because that was the magical part that people often talk about, and they say it saved your life when
Right.
um, it was your thing, that was it, bonding with the people in my neighborhood,
Right.
going out in mass to some sort of event, sometimes being a participant if I was with my crew, all that sort of stuff was, you can't really describe it, but that was the love. And I think that's the passion that you would hear from people
Right.
coming from that generation. That's what it was reflecting.
Mm.
No, for sure. It is definitely your thing. If I need anything hip hop, I come to you. Like if I to talk any hip hop, Davey is the man for sure. I wanted to just kind of give my background too,
Yes,
because
please.
how I grew up in Newport News, Virginia, and both my parents were actually born and raised in Jamaica. So my roots were not in the South like most of my high school friends. And early on, because my family was Jamaican, they were more connected to kind of Latin American folks there, Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Ecuadorians, and so on. And in my house, I remember my mom loved Motown, my dad played Bob Marley, right?
Mhm.
But I remember going down to Jamaica for vacations and being really interested in how Jamaican radio was way different than the radio I remembered back home. And so the radio I remember back home, like I can remember when disco was played during the day and then Quiet Storm at night, right? So my first introduction to hip hop was the skating rink. That's where I learned about hip hop. And I remember, Rapper's Delight, but the song that really kind of took me over to falling in love with it was actually UTFO's Beats and Rhymes. That was one of my favorite songs to skate to. And then of course the shows that used to come from New York down the coast, right, to Virginia. And so saw all of those. So yeah, I just think it's interesting that we all kind of come from different backgrounds, but have been really, grew up with hip hop all our lives, for the most part. So
one of the things that I think to keep in mind and why that happens is, and we try to bear this out in the book, if we tell the story in terms of dates and times and treat it the way that Western construct wants us to know history, like remember this date, and we look at it as a linear type of thing, then it gets boring and everything gets lost. But when we tell the story from the standpoint of we're going through some stuff, everybody's going through some stuff. Jeff is going through stuff. You're going through stuff. I'm going through stuff. We're all going through stuff. And then we're going, there's something that I could relate to that draws me in. Expression, cultural expression. So everybody gets drawn into something that touches their heart and soul in ways that you can't describe, right? And when you see that these expressions, which are often commodified and bought and sold by corporations, it strips away the functionality that it innately has in our community. So when Jeff is on the wall, that expression goes a lot deeper than him just spray painting. There's something about you're going to see, you're going to hear, you're going to recognize me. Finding community in this thing called hip hop and everybody bonding. Like I could go across the street to the projects and I don't have to know everybody, but we all locked in because there's a shared sense of adventure and a shared sense of value that we put to these expressions that people are doing. It would be the equivalent to going to a church. You go to a church, you might not know everybody, but once they start singing, everybody starts swaying, everybody starts clapping, everybody's like, and everybody gets into it, and then you feel that spirit and it touches you. And so now you want more of it. So even if we don't know each other, I see it's like, Tina, we going to the jam because there's something that connects us. And we don't have words for it at 12, 13, or 14, or even 15 or 16. We definitely didn't have words for it in the 70s when I'm coming up.
No culture per se,
But we knew there was something magical about it. And now that 30, 40 years have passed, we can look and go, oh, this is why my parents felt the same way about James Brown and Sly Stone and soul. Something connected them. And this is why my grandparents felt the way about Bobby Blue Band and B.B. King and blues artists. It touched them, or even your parents. I'm sure your dad, you now know why he had to hear that Bob Marley. There was something
all the time, which I love. Now I appreciate way more than I did back then.
It touched the soul. And your mom with Motown. Motown touched the soul. And
absolutely.
So we know that now, but when you're in the middle of it coming up, you don't know. You just know it's like, yo, I need more of this. And it's definitely something that society ain't giving me and they don't understand. But I just know that this thing here, I'm locking in and I'm sticking with it. And here all three of us are.
Right. All right. No, I feel you on that for sure. Let's talk about the book. There's a few things that I for sure want to get to. And let's talk basically first about the difference between the original and the young adult version. So the original was out in 2005 and I have been using it pretty much ever since. But when I read this, I was like, I can absolutely use this new YA version for my college level course. It's definitely not just for young adults, but it is storytelling. Like I said, the art of storytelling. And I heard you, Davey, tell hip hop ed guy Chris Emden that your students basically were born after the whole Biggie Tupac thing. So they didn't even really know the stories, and much less the original pioneers, right? So I just wanted to ask you both, like, is that one of the purposes, to teach that it's a YA edition, to teach that history to new generations? How are the two versions different? And Jeff, was it hard to quote unquote take stuff out of the original, which was longer, right?
Yeah, no, that well, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
Dave has a particular perspective on that that we can talk about. But
Okay.
well, well, I've been blessed. We've been blessed to have like this book have a long life, and my editor Monique Patterson came, to me 4 or 5 years ago. I can't even remember exactly when now. It all kind of blurs together, but she was like, this book has had a life and we need to make it available for the next generation.
Right.
And I was like, wow, that's actually, an amazing type of thing. And, both Dave and I are hip hop parents. My kids are older now, they're in their 20s.
Mm.
Um, but, it's the type of thing where we've both gone through that phase of thinking about like, well, what are the things that we need to know or that we need to be able to pass on so that they know
Right, right,
what it is
right,
that they should be armed with, right? Because one of the things about this is hip hop culture, Black freedom culture is always the repository of all these stories that society wants to suppress, that actually
sure.
hold the keys, right, to solving a lot of the issues, the problems that we face today. And that's exactly why a lot of these stories are suppressed. And so
Absolutely.
we said,
Yeah.
wow, let's like this is an opportunity to be able to bring it to another generation of folks who are gonna, gonna come after us, and they're gonna inherit the world that we were trying to, make change in. So the first person I reached out to was my older brother Davey. I won't tell you how much older, but my older brother Davey, and I was just like, because Dave is like the storyteller, par
Absolutely.
excellence. He, as you were mentioning earlier, he's the one that holds all the stories of
Yeah.
of our communities, right?
Right.
Our communities that come
Right.
together and that are trying to survive
Right.
under different types of repressive types of situations. So I went to Dave and just was like, Dave, like, will you get down with me? And luckily, after hemming and hawing a little bit, not that much, but he was like, yeah, let's do this. And so
Good,
we
good.
were able to
Yeah.
kind of do that. And the first thing that we decided was we're not going to dumb this down. Like the
Hmm.
kids need to know the truth. They
Right.
need to be able to be armed with these stories, because these stories are about resilience. They're stories
Right.
about how people overcome. And if
Right.
they can see other young people in the previous generations that came before them and what they did to be able to make it work and to make a way out of no way, which is this idea, right, that bridges like Asian culture, Asian American culture, and African American culture, this notion of being able to make a way out of no way, then they will be able to feel inspired to wake up
Right.
in the morning and to be able to do it themselves. So that was kind of the vibe that we kind of took to it. And as we were going through it, the book was pretty much done, and then 2020 happened, the
Mm.
pandemic and the uprisings
Right.
after the murder of George Floyd, and we were
Right.
like, we have to
Have
put
to.
this in there. So stop the
Right.
presses. And so the book now has this arc of starting with Black Power and moving all the way up through Black Lives Matter. And that felt like just really right to us. That felt like a complete narrative. So,
For sure.
so
For sure.
that's some of the things that we kind of did with it.
The other thing is, things that were missing in the first edition, we added.
Hmm.
And we were intentional about a number of things we wanted to include. Um, One was we have a chapter on women,
Right. Right.
but
I
we didn't,
wanted to talk about
yeah,
that. Yeah.
but we didn't tokenize. Women are throughout from
Right.
page one to the last page, and their
Right.
contributions are, you know, purposely woven in.
Right.
So if we're mentioning Kuhurk, we're mentioning Cindy Campbell.
Right.
If we're talking
Absolutely.
about Grandmaster Caz, we're talking about Shaw Rock, right?
Right.
All the way through. So that's important. The second thing is that we understood that we're at a point in time, and hip hop does this every 20 years, where new generations come up and they want to know their own history.
Right.
This was going back in the late 80s, early 90s. People were trying to find their voices. They stopped trying to be New York and they were themselves, right?
Right.
I'm going to be Oakland. I'm going to be
Right.
LA. So
Right.
we're at that moment again where people like, I want to know the Philly story.
Right.
The New
Right.
York thing is cool. I want to know the LA story. I want to know the
Right.
Houston story. And these stories now are 40 years deep.
Yeah.
So, and not counting the scenes that were already in existence prior to New York style hip hop expression showing up. And
Mhm.
so we wanted to give a nod to that. And we're doing the hip hop thing of like, look, Tina, we know you got stories in LA. We
Right.
can't tell those stories in 300 pages. So we're going to give people an
idea.
understanding.
Right.
There is a LA story. Here's a
Right.
couple of things, and then it's up to you or
Right. Got
somebody in
you.
LA to take the baton and run with that. We know there's an
Which is laid
international-
out really well, yeah,
Right.
because you got all of it in there, but then anyone can go and give the more in depth in
Right.
that region, right?
Right. And so we did the same thing on the international tip.
Mhm.
And then the other thing that we also were doing was also understanding that systemic oppression is consistent. The
Right.
names change.
Right.
So-
Yeah.
So when we note the systemic oppression, then people go, oh, snap, police brutality. I can
Right.
relate to that. Oh,
Right.
unequal education, poverty, all these things happen. And so the stories of triumph are constantly showing up, the stories of
Right.
resistance. And some people might not get it, but that's for parents and other people to be
Mhm.
able to
The
lay that out
context.
and give
Right.
it to them. Lastly, if you, and I'm going to use this as an analogy, if we asked about the history of jazz right now,
Mhm.
most of us will go, maybe the bebop era,
Mhm.
Milton's Playhouse. We're going to talk about Coltrane. We're going to talk about Miles Davis, Ornette Coleman. We're going to go there.
Right.
Nobody wants to hear about Buddy Bolden and Sidney Bechet and the, Dixieland Jazz Orchestra.
Right.
Nobody wants to go back to New Orleans at the turn of the century.
Yeah.
And we feel like in many ways, we're going to hit a corner in a minute where nobody wants to go back to the 70s. Most
Right.
histories are now in the 90s. And
Yeah,
pretty
no,
soon,
70s is now ancient
Yeah,
history.
yeah. and a
Right.
lot of the history, even more, is going
Right.
to be 2000. And so
Right.
we wanted to acknowledge that and say, look, you have some firm history here. So you can always go back to that. It's there.
Right.
That's our gift to the world, because we
Right.
know that moving on, people are going to be like, in 2004, this guy named Drake showed up and he put it down. He was the first one to
Yeah, he
rap
would.
and sing.
Right.
Joking
Right.
around.
He was probably like 10 years old in 2004, right?
Right.
But I'm just saying, but people can
No,
tell that
got you.
story from the jump off, but then they know that they can actually reference
Like,
that.
yeah, thank goodness for archiving, right?
Yeah. So we're archiving.
Right. Thank goodness for archive. I mean, it's true. And to be fair, like, even though we might have learned a few things when we were coming up in terms of what was considered history, 50 years ago during my time. So that would have been, Harlem Renaissance, UNIA, Marcus Garvey, and all of that. I didn't really learn until I went to college, right?
Right.
So you might have known a little bit, but you didn't really know, the details of it. So to be fair, for sure, putting it in record is important for folks that are, coming up way after, to be able to go back and access.
And
So-
and we're at a time, because none of the hip hop doesn't happen in a vacuum, and neither does the writing of this book.
Right.
You write this book, you have senators like Tom Cotton in Oklahoma who's like, no federal funds if you want to talk about the 1619 project.
Right.
We have the rewriting of textbooks in Kentucky and in Texas
I
where
do have a question, that relates to
Okay,
the
yes.
rewriting of history. Yeah.
so-
No, but you're absolute. I'm good. Yeah, for sure.
So we wanted to play that role of a griot and make sure that that is there, because even now, with hip hop, you have people rewriting history,
Sure.
and some of the people who are pioneers, to be honest, don't remember.
Of
So,
course, I mean, my memory is not great either. So yeah, I get it. No, for sure, for sure. I do like, there was a couple things like obviously bringing it all the way to the present and these kind of transformative times we've been living in with the pandemic, the movements, the political upheaval is really important for new readers. So I know for it relates to kind of like present day storytelling, and a lot of my students are going to also relate to the systemic oppression you talked about, of living in the hood, and they may not have known about the Bronx roots, but they can definitely relate to the conditions that still go on to this day, right? So
Yeah.
I totally hear you on that. All right, let me just and you've kind of touched on this already, but as it did in the original, I really love the attention given to the social and cultural roots of hip hop. How important was that to you both? Like to make sure folks really got a good sense of, its social, economic, and cultural roots.
I mean, it's totally critical. The original and this book, what they share is this kind of flipping back and forth between the the creativity, the
Right,
creative force, that young people are bringing, young Black people are bringing to the situation, and the
right,
violence that they're facing in the street, from the
right,
state, right, from
right,
the institutions, um, and very much in terms of from block to block, and so the theme that comes up, I think, in the book is the way that folks figure out ways to be able to move forward, right, in
right,
the face of all this violence, right, and
right.
we're talking not just like physical violence. We're
Yeah,
talking about the violence of removing, state subsidies from education. We're
right,
talking about the
right,
violence of, taking out healthcare from places. We're talking about
right,
all of those forms of violence that
right.
really, put people into desperate types of situations. And then out of that, young people figuring out how to make peace, right?
Yeah,
Literally, like gangs putting down their arms and saying, we're going to piece ourselves up. And then when that
right,
happens, this explosion of creativity that happens,
right.
that drives actually the culture forward from the Bronx in 1971, Los Angeles 1992, and then again, right after
And
Nipsey,
the
yeah, the
crack
crack
era,
era,
at Latin quarters, in
Latin
'86,
Quarter,
the golden
1980,
era,
1988, yeah.
Yeah. So
And then right on up through Nipsey, right? Through,
Right, right,
after Nipsey is killed, folks saying we're gonna figure out how to piece this up, and now we're living in this like renaissance, this sort of cultural renaissance where there's amazing work that's happening. It's coming from all kinds of young people,
right.
across the board, and it's related directly to the creativity of the young organizers
Yeah,
who
I
are who
definitely want to
have
talk about that.
pulled like 25 million people into the streets. So,
Right, right,
so it's so important for us not just to talk about, the hip hop musicians, but to talk
right,
about the hip hop activists and the hip
right.
hop organizers
Absolutely.
and the hip hop thinkers that have come out of this. That's what the movement has spawned. It's been a full movement that's
Right,
produced all kinds of creativity all across the board.
and
right.
it's also a continuation of the movements before, which we
Sure,
acknowledge. The Black
sure.
Arts Movement would be the immediate predecessor to hip hop. The Last Poets, the Watts Prophets.
Right,
Those elements, whether they were directly connected or not. That generation. When you look back, a lot of people were artists, but a lot of people were thinkers. A
right.
Mary Baraka could spit a poem, but a Mary Baraka could also lay down some,
Sure.
some
Theories.
some theory. Sonia
Right,
Sanchez, same thing. If you ever,
right,
if I talk to, former Panthers, Erica Huggins can do a poem, but she can also
right.
be like, let me break down some
Strategies.
political wisdom. And so we include
Right.
that, and we don't get caught up in the I think the separation that society wants to do, which is
Right.
like the
Hmm.
artists are here and the thinkers are
Right,
there. It's like, no,
right.
practitioners are
Holistic. Yeah.
holistic. Yeah, you don't have to
Right,
be on the mic to to bring theory to the party. And in fact,
Right.
sometimes you don't have, sometimes it's not appropriate. Sometimes we just got to have a
Right.
conversation. And then when we're done, we can
Yeah. Right.
sing and dance. So
Sure. Sure. Okay. Yeah. I also was extremely relieved that Style Wars was still given the attention it deserved in this edition. And so, I love this style as defiance, aggression, and science as it relates to the elements. I think you explained them so well. Do you want to talk about how you kind of conceptualize that and why that was important to you? Why style is so important to hip hop?
I mean, the thing that comes out of the 1971 Gang Peace Treaty in the Bronx is um, young folks are moving from a competition between like space, right? Where
Hmm.
you got one gang on one block and their clubhouse, and you got another gang on another block with their clubhouse, to coming out and gathering,
Right.
rather than like protecting themselves from each other. They're coming together to gather, and when they gather, then it's like it's this battle of styles. So it's like that's really the engine that drives this amazing innovation in the culture, in those early days of hip hop that they've like kind of lived through. I should pass the mic
Right.
to you at this particular point.
so
That's
style is also creativity.
right.
Style is innovation.
Innovation.
And
Hmm.
if we, we didn't go knee deep into it, but when you think about the style that shows up, and I think we talk a little bit about it, the style is like, I can't afford, $100 jeans, but I can figure out how to wear these $10 jeans by putting a crease in it, putting
Right.
my name on the back, airbrushing my name on a shirt, rolling my pants leg up and creating a new way in which you wear your clothing.
Right.
Style is also showing up and being like, I will create a speaker system that can outdo yours. So,
Right.
many of us, built our own sound systems. I mean, when I moved out to Cali, my first set of speakers were things that I built, you know,
Right.
um, that's style, you know.
Right.
Um,
Right.
you're looking at people who had to beautify their world at a time when they were being discarded and it was made to be ugly. And to show you
Right.
how deep that is, one of the things that New York City did with those burnt out buildings was to avoid having people look at the devastation. They would paint the outside of the buildings and make it look
Right.
like people lived there so commuters wouldn't see the devastation. But on the other side of that, people were like, you're going to know my name, so I'm going to beautify the world in my
Right.
own way. I'm going to do it in ways that make sense. And so the
Right.
way that graph artists were able to evolve,
Hmm.
where their signatures and their pieces, that's technological advancement. You know,
Absolutely.
the way that you were taking music and remixing it before sampling, before beatboxes, before things that the
Right.
industry looked at and said, let's create something to actually
Right.
accentuate what's going on. That is all style,
Absolutely.
and so we include the technological advancement, the creativity, all that is a part of it, and that's something we wanted to convey to people as well.
Right. And I just something you said reminded me of, remember we were talking before it started about the verses, the Isley Brothers verse, Earth, Wind and Fire, the elements. And D Nice, was the DJ who you mentioned in here a couple times as well. And it was interesting because Harvey's a hater sometimes when it comes to hip hop, Steve Harvey. But what D Nice did in the intermission was basically play some of the old
Yeah.
songs that were re-sampled and then brought in the new one just to show like how innovative like hip hop was. And I caught on to that. I was like, I see what you're doing there and appreciated it. Yeah.
Mm.
But look what he did in the pandemic a
Yeah.
year ago, almost a year ago to this date. Well, we're in April, so I think it happened in March. But we're sitting here like, what are we going to do? We're stuck in our houses. You
Right.
know, people are like, well, we can give you Netflix. And people are like, I already watched all the Netflix. I already
Right,
watched.
right,
But D
right.
Nice
You
took
already
it back.
Netflixed and chilled.
Yeah. But he took
Right,
it back to the basics. And then what he
right.
did was he laid a blueprint on how to build community.
Sure.
Let me show you that I see you. Tina from LA in the house, Jeff from Oakland in the house,
Right,
Alexandra from LA, acknowledging people and
right.
build community. Now
Sure
you look
did.
forward, you take a platform like Twitch, which was
Hmm.
made for gaming. There are
Yeah.
more people
Oh,
DJing on
true.
Twitch than there are
True.
gaming, right? So we changed what that means now. And
That's a great example.
the blueprint for it is
Hmm.
like when you go on there, you gotta do the shout out, the very thing that D Nice was doing
Right.
to
Mhm.
make it full circle, which is what Herc did
Right.
or Coke LaRock did as a way to
Right.
make sure that nobody messed up their parties. It was an ingenious thing. Oh, I got
Yeah.
the thug coming in, Tina and her crew. Let me shout you out. Jeff and
Right,
his
right. Make
Jeff and
sure we
his
don't
boys.
start
Right?
nothing.
So you
Right.
walk in there and you're like, oh man, they made
It's so
Dave, I see
silly.
you. But
Right,
let's go back to it. He even says, sometimes we make people feel important. Tina, your limousine's outside.
right,
Tina got a limousine. No, you don't got a limousine. But if I'm making you feel good, there's no reason for you to turn up and act out
right.
at the party because society
Smart
is saying
stuff. Yeah.
we don't see you, but I'm
Hmm.
saying I see you. And this
Right.
is, in 2020, a lot of things were, we were able to build community just by the simple
Absolutely.
act of
Even though we
acknowledgement.
couldn't get together. Absolutely. No, those are great examples. I appreciate that, Davey. I actually didn't even think about that Twitch thing because, yeah, my initial introduction to Twitch was my son was a gamer, right? So years ago, I knew it as, I was like, y'all just sit there and watch people play games. What is this? but now I do use Twitch to listen to some of my DJs that I've loved during this quarantine time. So absolutely, communities have been built. Let's go back to talking about, you talked about women and why, how you wove it through the whole book. I really loved all the stories of how critical women were to hip hop's development, not just, artists, but behind the scenes as well. And, I gained a similar appreciation during last month's Women's History Month. The Hip Hop Education Center, Martha Diaz, and Universal Hip Hop Museum were doing a lot of great events that you should look up if you haven't seen them on the Hip Hop Education Center website. But basically, women have been there since day one, and you gave a lot of great stories. Roxanne Shante was one of my favorite, and so you already kind of talked about why it was important to tell her story. But is there any of those you want to highlight?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, where do we
Yeah,
start, right? I guess we should start with Cindy Campbell. I mean, because
yeah,
if there wasn't Cindy Campbell, there wouldn't have been a day one. Like
right,
Cindy was the one who organized the party. There's like a direct line between Cindy Campbell being the first hip hop promoter and going all the way up to Jay-Z now and Jay-Z and Beyonce. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like as business people, right? As
yeah,
somebody who is promoting hip hop as something to for folks to be able to come to.
right,
She made it possible for her brother Herc to spin,
yeah,
and thereby created the whole scene. And actually, quiet as it's kept, she really built that early scene because she would go to all the high schools because she had friends throughout the borough, and basically try to get Herc to play at all these schools. And Herc came in with his music, playing it a certain kind of way, right? He's playing like James Brown. He's playing the stuff that's not on the radio,
right,
and
right,
people are coming to the parties for that. And so
right,
like Cindy built that, right? Cindy was the
yeah.
Diddy of her time. We like to tease her about that. Like she was the person that really like wove all of that stuff together. I
Right.
mean, there's so many stories. I mean, Dave, you could talk about Sharrock or
Yeah,
other
just
folks,
one
right?
to highlight because they were really good.
Mm,
Right. Well, the thing with first of all with Cindy, you got to acknowledge Tony Blackman, from
Hmm.
Freestyle Union,
mm,
who was really the one that kind of pulled my coattail. I want to say about 15 years ago, or when I was at a panel in Montreal, and she's like, "That's a good panel, but how come nobody mentioned Cindy?" I'm like,
Right.
huh? And then from that day on, it was like, oh no, you're right. We got to make sure that we include that, that story and the other stories. But in terms of just, what stands out for me is Shah Rock, who
Yeah.
actually got a chance to talk to
Lucky
me
for
the other
plus
day.
one more. Yeah.
mm,
So if you're an MC, which I was back in the days, there were several prototypes. Melly Mel would be one, but you had to have that voice, and very few can
Right.
match it. Grandmaster Caz would be another because he was a storyteller, and he becomes a thing that people pattern. But the other one was Shah Rock, And the way that she could work that echo chamber, the way that she brought a certain type of calmness, but was lethal on the mic. Now people are kind of like, yeah, bitter style. I borrowed that from her,
Right,
but
right.
she was dope MC. And I think a lot of us picked up her cadence and just was, I mean, her crew was dope. KK Rockwell and all those guys were good. But when Sha Rock got on there and had her arms folded and was standing and rocking that mic, all eyes were on her, because not because she was, an attractive woman and all that, but because she was just so damn raw.
Right.
And I think, over time we get to have that deeper appreciation. And, when we tell those stories about her. And then of course we ended off with a lot of the activists and
Right, right.
activism.
Which, yeah,
Yeah, which a lot of it is around women and
sure,
folks,
for sure.
that have done things. I mean, it ranges from Melina Abdullah to Kat
Right,
Brooks to,
right.
we can go on. People like yourself,
Yeah.
deserve props from Hip Hop Congress, and
Right, right. Shout out
so,
Hip Hop Congress.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Right,
so women have always throughout the movements have been a glue,
right,
that has been ignored, whether it was Dr. King, we talk about the Montgomery
right,
bus boycott, and we
right,
ignore Joanne Robinson and
right,
Black Women's Council. That was really the glue that made that happen. She's almost written out, right?
right. Or my favorite, Ella Baker, that,
Ella Baker, who you
the,
bring up. Yeah.
right, yeah, yeah.
And we
So,
can go on. The Panthers, most of them were women, right?
right,
So
right, right.
we'll close
Yeah.
with saying, both Jeff and I are married. We have wives who weren't trying to have us walk in the door and do a book. And my wife teaches, and
Okay.
and my daughter is cognizant enough to know that, like, what kind of book is this? We're the women, we're the
Right,
girls. So
right, right.
we didn't want those type of
Rep
problems.
correctly, pops. Rep correctly, pops. Right.
We didn't want them type of problems in the home. So we were
Right, I
definitely going.
got you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Honorable, yeah.
All right. So yeah, so let me say we have a few more minutes and I have a couple more questions I definitely want to get to. You already talked a lot about, kind of the how hip hop connected across geography, and you also highlighted a lot of regional differences. Um, I love that. I think that's really important. And I think that it was definitely grown in this second edition, right? With the kind of South and, so on. And so even though I know you can't do them all in one book, it does, like you talked about before, give other researchers, hip hop, researchers the opportunity to like dive into this area, because everyone has a different unique story, right? So that was something you wanted to definitely include, were those regional differences, huh?
Mhm. Yeah, most definitely. Because, part of the story, so the original book kind of ends in 2000, and so there's 20 years that we had to catch up on, 21 years that we had to kind of catch
Right,
up on. Um, and really, we in the original book, we were so deeply involved in our local scenes, Bay Area stuff. I was living in LA for a little while, so
right,
sort of whole West Coast type of vibe. And you know, in the first book there was a strong focus on New York and Los Angeles,
right,
but the story of the 90s is really about how all of these different types of geographies, right? All of these different types of
right.
places build these scenes, and then that gets replicated all around the world, right? So,
Yeah,
so what's happening in the 90s, in the early 90s, right? In all of these places, Houston,
right.
Miami, Raleigh, right? Like Detroit, right? Like Philly, of course. All these St. Louis, right? All of these different
Yeah,
types of places, Seattle. Um, then you see like the global network starting up by the late 90s. So you see
yeah,
Seoul, Korea. You see like,
yeah.
Paris is jumping off. Paris has got the biggest non-English speaking market in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you got folks in South Africa, right? Folks in South Africa fighting
Right,
apartheid with hip hop. Folks in South Korea fighting authoritarianism with hip
right,
hop, right?
right.
Um, so all of that stuff was really important for us to be able to kind of weave that together. And again, like you're saying, hopefully that gives people like a way to be able to to come up and get interested. Young people come up and get them interested in speaking to their elders, building some
Right.
intergenerationality, and
Right.
really getting the story of their communities, because it's all there. It's all there in the
Right.
art.
Yeah.
So I have a unique scenario of being in New York in the 70s and moving out here in the 80s,
Right.
and coming out here and trying to MC, and people be like, oh, that's kind of what my daddy did when he was, meaning that people had a referencing point
Already. Right.
that they were already doing something similar. They didn't call it MCing, they didn't call it rapping, but people did rhyme, they did
Right.
toast, they
Right.
signified.
Right.
um if you were to show a breakdance move, somebody was going to go, oh, that's kind of like the dances we did. So you
Right.
realize, like in
Yeah.
Oakland where I'm at, there's a dance scene that goes back to the 60s. Had nothing to
Yeah.
do with New York. In
Right.
LA, similar type of things, right? And
Yeah.
these are rich histories. And so what started to emerge for us is like what was going on in Washington, D.C. at the same time hip hop was going on in New York. Oh, go go.
Right.
What was
Right.
going on in Chicago? House. What was going on in LA or the Bay? Funk scenes. What were going on in
Right.
Houston? And you start to see that Black people weren't sitting around just going, what are
Yeah.
they doing in New York? And then taking their cue. They
No.
were already doing their own thing.
Right.
And depending on what part of the country you went in, they might integrate different parts of it. So in the Bay, it'd be like, okay, I like that rap thing. I don't know about this, multi-syllable thing, because you can't understand it when you're
Right.
driving your car. We want that bass and, so
Right.
you
Right.
you you
Right.
brought
Right.
things that made sense to you. Also, different places had musicianship. So when you
Mm.
go to some parts of the country, like here, a lot of people were in bands already.
Right.
E40's in a band. Grambling, Kyrie's in a band, right? All these people are in bands. And so that becomes important to see how they integrated. If you talk to, Egyptian loving people down in LA, they're very clear. Like our influence was Prince and
Right.
Kraftwerk, not
Right.
necessarily what was coming out of New York, which means that they looked at the same iconic figures that we may have in this place. It might have been Kraftwerk, and came
Mm.
up with a different interpretation, the same way
Sure.
that dancers in New York looked at James Brown and had a different way of interpreting his dance than people out west who looked at that same James Brown and picked up a different move. Same thing with Bruce Lee. So
Right.
that's a very fascinating and
It
important.
is. Yeah, and there are some, I remember a book on 37, but there are some books, but there's definitely room for more of, like you said, those stories in
Mhm.
those areas and community to make sure we, get those archived for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so I do want to talk about the last loop because I think that's important, but I want to, just again, for me, some of this was really autobiographical, right? So like my hubby was at that Malay in Long Beach that
Oh,
he was there at that. I
okay.
was at one probably around the same time. I think it was the same tour in Virginia where, we all had to I remember exactly where I was on UCLA campus when the verdict came out. I remember being able to see the fires from my window when I was living out here. So it was just a lot. Just was like, coming back. But I actually have a couple more questions. Hopefully we'll have time. I want to definitely talk about the the final loop, 1998 to 2020.
Okay.
Um, for me, definitely is really important addition. I know my students in particular will be able to tap in personally. I want to ask about, we talked about it a little bit before, but like particularly the Black Lives Matter, the organizing around it. Why was that important? And why it is hip hop? Why it really is it falls under hip hop, right? And so I kind of want to talk about why you definitely needed to include that in this book.
Well, there's this direct line, from Black Lives Matter back through a lot of the organizing that was happening around the turn of the millennium, in Los Angeles, right? In all across the country, really.
Right.
But thinking about, like, for instance, um, uh, Hip Hop for Respect, for
Yeah.
instance, in
Mhm.
New York City, after the killing of Amadou Diallo,
Right.
the case of Abner Louima, the brutality that was visited on Abner Louima, and how, young hip hop um, artists and activists poured into the streets. And these kinds of local movements against police brutality, for environmental justice, for better education, for educational opportunity, all of these types of things, build into things like the Hip Hop Congress,
Right,
um,
right,
the National
right.
Hip Hop Political
I
Convention.
was there. Yeah, another
Yeah, right. You were there.
autobiographical.
We were there. 2004,
Right,
right? Like this is like really
right.
the moment that, like, if Obama really told the truth, like it begins there in Newark in
Yeah,
2004,
yeah,
where you have literally
2004.
thousands of folks coming from across the country,
Under the Gary, Indiana kind of model, remember?
exactly.
Right,
Mary
right.
Baraka, right? 1972 National Black
And
Film.
and
1972.
and Amiri is there
He
Yeah,
was
I
there
at the
remember.
convention,
I
and
remember.
him.
Yeah.
he was leading
So
it. Yeah.
yeah, so Amiri Barak is there along with Charles Barron, along with a number of people. Chuck D's there, and
Hmm.
these are all people that laced, a younger generation with that
Right.
political wisdom and said, these are the things that you do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Charles Barron's speech about
Right.
some of y'all don't want to vote, but that's a weapon that you can use. Amiri
Right.
Baraka giving that history of Gary, Indiana, and
Yeah.
the 72 convention, which you can't even really find, the
Right. Right.
documentaries and stuff on that online. Those were important. And then it gets picked up by others like Russell Simmons,
Right.
Diddy, and others who do that.
Mhm.
But those are important arcs that take you all the way up to the Ozone Awards
Right.
in 2008,
Yeah.
when Obama is running, or 2000, yeah,
Right.
2008.
Right.
But if you remember, there's the hip hop political convention is in Las Vegas, and it has a
Oh
couple of
yeah.
thousand people there. But when you went down to the Ozone Awards in Houston, the week later, there's more than 10,000 people that are there.
Right.
And you can see the footage when they're sitting on the panel, and you got everybody from Rick Ross all the way down to Nelly, to David Banner, to Ludacris. And they all say, we are going to put on our Sunday best, and we're
Right.
going to use our collective power, and we're going to make sure this man gets elected and nobody's going to mess up. Bun B, he goes
Yeah.
to those conventions and he says, I'm here to be a kingmaker for my community, right?
Right.
Nelly is at those conventions, and everybody has a particular role that they're playing in terms
Right.
of how they're going to engage the community, using their collective powers. So some of that we caught on a documentary, which we used to actually flip Texas, at least Harris County,
Right.
with the help of those artists from Trader Truth on down, who gave us, their videos, who distribute that. Those were the stories that we wanted to capture. And to Jeff's point, that is there's that line that
Yeah.
that really comes out of the thievery of the 2000 election, which
Yeah.
leads to the political convention, which
Right.
leads to a bunch of electoral victories from
Right.
2006, where we take over the Congress, to Obama getting elected twice. And if
Yeah.
we start naming off all the people that were participants, many of them are knee deep, not only in that convention, but they're
Yeah.
also knee deep in just being practitioners of that art.
Organize it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Abs-
they're MCs and
oh,
DJs.
right. 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 For sure.
Also Rosa Clemente running for
Yeah.
office
She.
is very important as well.
Right. Right.
And
And
so
Bun B did too.
Yeah.
right, but
Right.
Mhm.
yeah, so there's a radical side to
Right.
the mainstream side of the
Sure.
of our
Sure.
politics as well.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think, like you said, our generation, the radical side is, rooted in Public Enemy, Chuck D, and so on, was kind of, where I learned quite a bit of my politics during that kind of era of Black nationalism or Black power in hip hop and so on. And which reminds me, that was part of, you talk about it too, the, anti-apartheid movement, that was me in college. Yeah. So definitely it's been throughout. This kind of goes with it, but specifically to you, Jeff, because one of my favorite articles of yours is the one, It's Bigger Than Politics, The Real Shift is Cultural. I cite it all the time. And, just how you talk about generational shift that we were seeing in politics and organizing. And, it was written in 2010. So it was post Obama's first election and Gina, but it was before Trayvon, Ferguson,
Right.
and all of those.
Yeah.
And you talk about like how the left was behind because they weren't doing the cultural work, if you were, the narrative building and so on. But I've seen a change in that with this new BLM movement. What do you see the same thing? Like getting a lot better at that work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, that's sort of the the rallying cry for 2004 in the National Political Hip Hop Convention
Mm-hmm.
in Newark was, um, you know, it, if we leverage culture, then we'll be able to change politics.
Right.
And I think that everything that's happened since then has kind of just proven the wisdom of that particular outlook, right?
For
Um,
sure.
so we saw, in the 2008 election, as Obama was running, like nobody thought, oh, everybody was like, Obama for
Who?
president? And then you start seeing
Right.
like you literally start seeing the street art on the walls, right? The graffiti artists
Right,
coming out
right,
on the
right,
walls, and then there's this explosion of these images, and we're like,
right.
oh, something's happening here, right?
Yeah,
And that's preceding all of folks like Jeezy and everybody else saying, I'm going to get together. We're going to get
right,
together and we're going to vote him into office. So
right,
it was literally like the organizers on the ground, the folks who are doing and advancing the culture every day that were actually leading the way. And then the artists kind of came along.
yeah.
The folks who like launched BLM knew all of this type of stuff. They learned all of
Absolutely.
these
You
lessons.
can just tell, yeah, in
They
how they do it. I
They
can see
they
it.
did, yeah, and they
Yeah,
were all veterans of these campaigns in which they use hip hop to
right,
activate people and to move people, each and every one of them.
right,
And I think that, they have been very, very smart and wise about how they've been able to lead with culture to be able to move
right.
people. And that's how
Yeah,
you get to the point where when something happens, suddenly everybody's in the streets and
right,
all the training has happened and people know exactly where to go, what to do, and the foundation is there for this
right.
new generation to be able to kind of take the torch and run with it and
Yeah,
really literally build the biggest like movement that we've ever seen. Um so yeah, and that in turn has moved the artists, right? The artists have had to react to that,
sure,
because we
sure.
got to represent
And even
and
not even like some reacted, but some, like you said, were incorporated. So the part of the book where you talk about the 2005 movement for Black Lives convening, I think 2015, right? Was it?
Yeah.
yeah.
And how We Gonna Be All Right, Kendrick Lamar's song was kind of the theme song. One of my organizer friends, Diane, she was there, and she, was able to tell me the story that you laid out here in the book in terms of the community protecting that child and so on, and then breaking out into that chant. So it was a powerful, powerful moment.
hmm
See, one thing about that 2015 is that at the same time that you had in Cleveland that Black Lives Matter convention,
Hmm.
which has about 3 to 4 thousand people there,
Right.
right down the road, the same weekend, there's about 30,000 people, mostly Black folks from Cleveland, that are also having a gathering, which they do every year. And, and hip hop and, another side of that is a gathering thing for them as well. And
Sure.
so the point that I'm making is that there are s- uh, uh, many avenues in which the expression comes. So sometimes you may see it this way, and
Hmm.
other times you may see it that way. And I think it's important to note that what's consistent is having these expressions, and
Right.
also understanding that many of these artists, or at least this genre, has functions, for
Yeah.
different levels of people. So there may be something that speaks to younger people, may speak to more
Right.
radical people, may speak to more middle of the road folks.
Right.
But the bottom line is that you have to acknowledge that it's there. And I'll say one thing: if hip hop was that weak, you wouldn't have ambassadorships in this country using hip hop to go around the world and try to use it as a way to further U.S.
Right.
imperialistic
Right.
policies, using the
Right.
culture as a way to
Right.
to draw people
Always.
in. So we can get into a
Right.
whole
Always
conversation
trying
of
to
that. Yeah,
use.
yeah.
Right.
So
I
they
mean, we
understand.
didn't even
Yeah,
get
yeah,
into
yeah,
like the corporate and
yeah.
all of that, but I mean, I appreciate what you both have brought to the table. I appreciate this book. I do want to give time for questions questions and answers. So if you have a question, I see a few already, but if you have not posted one yet, please use the Q&A function if you'd like Jeff and Dave to answer questions for you. So let me go ahead and start with Kevin Webb says he's 69, but the first hip hop group that he got into was Run DMC. And he wants to know what do you believe in terms of how influential they were? The other was Delinquent Habits.
So Run DMC is enormously important on a number of levels.
Mhm.
They're important. Some people, I think Chuck D calls them the Beatles of hip hop.
Yeah.
But they're important in the sense that for many people, they're the group that people first get their introduction to hip hop. They're a crossover group, and they're very intentional about crossing over. Even though hip hop had already integrated, or I shouldn't say integrated, was already having conversations with their punk rock and new wave counterparts. Run
Right.
DMC takes it mainstream. But
Right.
there's also a dividing line too that happens in 83, 84 when they do Sucker MCs. And they bring it back to the basics because the
That's my
first
favorite.
generation of people
Right.
were really patterning themselves after the Cameos and the Barcades and your George Clintons. They have costumes and they're doing that sort of showmanship. And Run DMC, who actually come from, a place where it's a little bit more affluent, ironically, are like, man, we're going to put on these fedora hats, these shirts, and they represent a street culture and they keep it
Right.
all the way raw like that. And I remember being in New York around that time and people was like, yo, this is the raw stuff, stripped down beats, rhymes, turntable, and that becomes the prototype for a long time. So they were big bridges and they were very, very influential, and they deserve all the props that they get for what they did. You can do a whole book on them alone.
Right, for
And there have
sure.
been.
And there,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I was gonna
Some good
say.
ones. Yeah.
Right. All right. What about from Tayo or Teo Amos? Hi, what do you think are the best hip hop movies or TV shows of all time and why? What do you think filmmakers get right when depicting the art form of hip hop on screen? So best hip hop movies or TV shows, why? And what do filmmakers get right? Jeff?
Wow. Hey, Tile, by the way. It's good to hear from you. Um, wow, that's such a great. So, you had mentioned at the beginning Wild Style and Style Wars, and those were sort of the movies that kind of set it off. And one was a documentary, and one was sort of documentary-esque, and they'll kind of live forever because they kind of captured a moment. And
Right.
the Wild Style movie by Charlie Ahern and Fab Five Freddy, where was a movie where they had put together a script, but they kind of just threw it out, and they just were like, "We're gonna follow where the artist will take us in this moment," and then they'd make this sort of like picture of the old school at the moment where it's breaking through in such a powerful way. So everything about it feels really legit, And
Yeah.
Star Wars, which was a documentary for PBS at first, right? And that comes out at a moment too where it's like we're just gonna go and take a camera and verite, just like follow folks
Right.
around, and then they fall into this huge sort of beef between the police and the city and these kids, right? Who are the city's trying to shut down these kids, and then you throw in this character who's a villain who's going over everybody, right, riding over everybody, Cap, and it's like
Right.
a whole other kind of thing. So I felt like those things, those two stories, as simple as they are, I think they'll never be topped. They'll never ever be topped. They're just such um, they're so true to kind of what folks were feeling and living at that particular moment. And I think like since then, obviously we've seen a lot of different ways that people have tried to package it.
Mhm.
I've tried to write like stories and scripts and stuff like that, but trying to
Right.
capture, I think, that kind of feel of what it's like, to be
Yeah.
in it on a day-to-day type of basis. It's been pretty rarely done.
I think Beat Street deserves a lot of credit and what it meant for
Okay.
people when it came out. The fact that Harry Belafonte was the executive producer, and knowing his understanding of culture and art, and
Right.
the role that artists should play in movements, I think is tremendously important. And what it meant, for people when they saw it. Um, I think in terms of just giving a narrative and telling your story, I think Straight Outta Compton did the job pretty well. I thought that movie caught a lot of there's what needed to be said for that particular
Right.
point in time. um, I don't think there's ever going to be a definitive movie
Right.
because everybody's experience regionally is going to be very different.
Yeah.
No documentary will capture it. So what I'm really happy though is to see the ascension of so many artists out of hip hop who gone on to become some stellar actress and actresses.
Right. Right.
Method Man is killing it now,
He's
right?
killing it.
His
Yeah.
role in The Deuce, he captures a part of New York that's great. But his
Right.
more recent roles,
Yeah.
I'm looking at people like Chael Chalker and the work that he did just in
Yeah.
penning some of the, what he did with the Marvel thing that he did, and even
Okay.
Ryan Coogler, and
Right.
what he did. So I'm looking at hip hop folks coming out of that. Mos Def is an incredible actor. Queen Latifah is an
Yeah.
incredible actress. And so seeing those folks take it to the next level, I think is important. And yeah, I'll give some props to that. It doesn't have to be you capture all four or five elements, or
Right. Right.
I mean, those first movies, they're going to be magical, but I think we're so much more now.
Right.
Uh, I want to see more movies that show us winning,
Yeah.
against oppression. I
Right.
want to see movies that don't have us running and under the gun, and I
Right.
want to have movies that don't show Black people being shot and killed. You know,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't want that. Those are going to be the movies that win. I just recently saw a Jim Kelly movie where he's beating the crap out of cops who tried to get at him. We need more movies like that.
Like that.
You know what I
Right.
mean? Instead of movies
Right.
where we get shot and
Right.
killed at the end. And so I think
Okay.
hip hop is moving in a direction where you're seeing the imagination. So shout out to people like Ryan, not Ryan, but Ryan Nicole, and
Mhm.
a dude named Wolf Hawk Jaguar, who's done
Mhm.
some incredible movies, independently. I think you're seeing a lot
Right.
of independent movies. And one last person I'll shout out would be Jeff Clannigan, who
Okay.
came out of the Bay Area with managing people like MC Twist, but has been a
Mhm.
very key architect in the
Right.
distribution of independent movies, especially Black movies, and also QD3, what he was doing. So we want to see the continued trajectory of the work that folks like that were doing, and people taking it to the next level.
Can I just add
Okay.
one more thing here?
Sure.
Super
Sure.
quick. Just to say, Tyler's an amazing filmmaker, and has been doing a lot of music
Okay.
videos and a lot of films. And I just like want to give it up for the younger folks who are coming into this,
Right.
especially the women. I mean, like Issa Rae's "Insecure" is hip hop to me, right?
No
And
doubt. Yeah.
that to me is like showing, and now that she's got this huge all around deal, right?
Right.
With HBO to kind of make stuff happen. It's just it's a powerful sort of picture of the way
Right.
that young Black women are actually changing the game right now, in
Yeah.
art form, including in film and TV. So, just a big shout out.
For sure, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, I think of documentaries and because that's what I use in class and I really enjoy. And some of they're older, but five sides of a coin because a lot of students don't really know about all the different elements and only know kind of rap and whatever. So that's one of my favorites. And Letter to the President for the
Yeah.
social cultural, yeah,
So
that you were featured in, David, for sure.
well,
I
had a big part of that, me and Thomas Gibson. Yeah.
Yeah, that one's a great one. I still use that. Yeah. So I forgot I wanted to mention when we were talking about that final loop that, we talk about the pioneers and how important they are, but I was wondering if and how you were going to deal with some of the controversy like the African Bambata and Crazy Legs and, make sure that we give attention to those issues. I wasn't sure so I was kind of waiting to see, okay, how we're going to deal with that. And I do see that you did mention it. Why was that important, you think? It didn't go into depth, but it did like mention.
Yeah, I mean hip hop is going through a reckoning right now with
Right,
regards to sexual abuse, sexual harassment.
right,
Um, and it was really important for us to be able to mention that, to be able
yeah,
to like not have it be a little asterisk or a footnote, but to be able to make sure that we were saying, this has happened.
yeah,
And it
yeah,
changes the way that we actually understand. I mean, even the original book, right? Like the narratives of that we write are they're set in time, right?
right,
Set
right,
in a
right,
particular time and place in what we know.
right.
This is a moment of reckoning, and so that had to kind of end up in the book. But it's
Okay.
part and parcel of us trying to, um, well, part and parcel, I could say for me, of trying to deal with the glaring omissions of the first edition,
Right. Okay.
and being able to make sure that this represents exactly where we're at in this particular time, where Black feminism is everything.
Right.
It's
Right.
transformed all of hip hop and transformed the culture
The
and
movement
mhm,
work,
right.
right,
So
happening.
that needed to be front and center
No,
in the
I'm
book.
glad. I mean, I was kind of waiting to make to see, so
Right.
I am glad it was mentioned. Dave, you wanted to add something, and then we
Yeah,
get a couple more questions.
yeah, and also, the acts of these individuals
Hmm.
should not overshadow the vibrancy
Right.
of this culture that is getting ready to be 50 years and all the
Right. Right.
contributions.
Right.
And the New York Post and mainstream, they will find the things that we do wrong and they will drag
Sure.
that and paint it on everything. For us as a community, yes, these things happen, they need to be acknowledged, and there need to be deep conversations and the
And
reckoning that Jeff talks about,
accountability.
but
Hmm.
that should not be the dominant story
Right.
in
And
terms of,
it shouldn't they still were, part of the
well, yeah,
pioneering story, and that is
yeah,
just facts. That's
yeah, you
facts.
don't erase them, you don't
Right, you
erase
can't
that.
erase them from the history, but right, absolutely. I've been told we only have a couple and we have like 7 questions. I do want to
Oh,
try to get through, even though we really only have time for 2 more. So Vanessa says, hello, thank you for hosting this. I have a question about hip hop and mental health. What are panelists' experience? I know Tony Blackman was mentioned and she does wonderful hip hop meditation work. I will mention and shout out Mike Myers, who is
yeah.
kind of Hip Hop Congress affiliate and is also now doing like monthly Instagram lives about mental health as well. Did any of you guys want to add?
Well, I think, along with that question of reckoning, I think we are all starting to look and understand that we have to take care of ourselves. Is something that we learned from our elders who were leaders in movements who got burnt out. We
Right,
are now seeing that if you don't take care of yourself, things will happen. And so there are other people that have been very outspoken. It may be somebody like a Kevin Powell, very,
right,
upfront. And it may be, some of the people that we see locally that are like, yo, we need to really, detox. We need to heal. We need to take some time out. We need to say no. We need to go
right,
on vacation, and and an act of resistance is bringing joy to ourselves and also healing ourselves. So I think that conversation is something that is prevalent throughout the hip hop diaspora, if I can use that
right,
word,
right,
where people like Stickmen, from Dead Prez and others,
right.
are
Good. Yeah.
definitely bringing that into the forefront. So I think um, we are now understanding that if you don't take care of yourselves, things are gonna go south. And we also have a lot of people who've died prematurely because
Right,
the health wasn't altogether there. And we also seen the inequality in the health system,
right,
as well. So
right.
health is a very important thing for all of us. Mental health, especially because we see what trauma,
Yeah,
has done.
yeah.
So
All right, one more question, and then just I'm going to try to combine a few of them. Someone else was talking about media influence and like new stars like Ice T, Ice Cube, and LL. It just reminds me of how funny, like you said, that time, place, and space. Like in the book, cop killer and how, you know, he was like just because they came after Ice-T for that, and now I can't turn on my TV and not see him in like, what's the show, Law and Order, or or the commercials for
Yeah.
the commercial. And so it's so interesting that, you know, he was kind of public enemy number one for a while and no longer. But let me shout out my hometown friend Kenny. I see you, Kenny, on here. Let's end with your question. How does hip hop in other countries and regions of the world compare lyrically with the diversity we see here in the United States?
Oh, this is great. That's a great question. Part of the chapter on the globalization of hip hop um, talks about, I was lucky enough to be able to go and see a lot of b-boy competitions around the world. And man, if you look at some of those b-boy crews that or b-girl crews too that are coming out from other countries, they're more diverse than they are in the US.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like you're talking about France, about Belgium, you're talking about all these different types of places. Um, they've got crews that are much, much more diverse than we got here. And that's pretty wild to kind of think about. But it's a product again of the way that hip hop is able to reach into the communities where folks need voice the most,
Right,
and
right,
where
right,
folks are able to then figure out how to come together and create communities, form these communities to be able to speak to each other. So communities in which there's Muslim and Jewish folks together, in which there's like different ethnic groups that are otherwise fighting
right,
each other
right,
in the same sort of crews together, dancing
right.
together. Like all of these kinds of things are what we're kind of seeing now. It's just a powerful thing to kind of be able to see, and it makes me feel good about the future of hip hop.
You know, I think the microcosm here is that we tend to be collectively very xenophobic. We only want to speak one language. We don't want to know nothing that goes to the north or south of us. We like to say hip hop is global, and then when you start asking questions, name 7 crews in Mexico right down the road. People
Right,
can't do it. Name
right,
somebody other than Drake that's up north. We can't do it. But when I've traveled, I found that people know each other all over the place. The people in Brazil know about the folks in South Africa. South Africa knows about the people in New Zealand. New Zealand knows about the people in France, and and goes on and on and on.
right.
And what that means is that the world is in a global cipher with itself, and
Right.
not,
And
and the
US is
US is Johnny come lately, and has to humble itself, has to
right,
come in there and be
right,
like, you are not, you're not the superpower
right.
that
We've
you like to
talked
think you
about
are, right?
right, right, right,
And so become a part of the world community and be at one with everybody else. And I think there are lessons that we can learn, from the actions of others. And we
right,
need to be more cognizant of where we're at and say, if we're going to be in the belly of the beast, and we know that hip hop is resistance to that belly of the beast, then we shouldn't bring belly of the beast ethos to the party.
absolutely.
We above all should be representing the resistance to it, not
Right,
trying to be the co-signers of it. And that's the challenge
absolutely.
we have when
Yeah.
we get on the global stage.
Right. All right. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dave. A wonderful
Thank
conversation.
you, Tina.
And
Thank you,
yeah,
Alexandra.
appreciate y'all. I don't know, Alexandra, do you want to take over or last words or what?
Go ahead and close us out. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Jeff and Dave. And as Tina mentioned, this has been a really incredible conversation. I encourage you all, the public, to please go out and purchase the book. It's available via SOM Books online, local Black bookstore here in Los Angeles, also in person if you're around. If not, we encourage you to purchase online. Use in your classrooms, use elsewhere. Really incredible resource. Thank you all for your brilliance in sharing this with us. And the conversation will be available in the coming days via our CAM YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you in person in the museum very soon, and you all have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.